If your childhood smelled like Sunday pot roast stretched across 3 meals, and your favorite memories involve making something from nothing with people who loved you fiercely, welcome home.
Tang instant breakfast drink. One glass contains a full day's supply of vitamin C, and Tang tastes great.
The 1970s working class wasn't just about modest means. It was belonging to a community that understood struggle without naming it, where pride lived alongside poverty. A world where neighbors shared freely, kids invented kingdoms from cardboard, and family bonds were forged making do together. These 30 signs are a love letter to resourcefulness and joy that bloomed between paychecks, when having less meant appreciating more, and love was measured in what was made to last. Let's start with something that defined working-class kitchens across America: government cheese. This wasn't cheese you bought at a store. This was 5-pound blocks of processed cheese product distributed through federal food assistance programs, and it came in plain boxes with simple black lettering that announced exactly what it was and where it came from. The sensory experience was unmistakable. The weight of that block when your mom brought it home, wrapped in generic packaging that screamed welfare to anyone who saw it. The cheese itself was dense, almost waxy in texture, with an orange color that didn't quite match any cheese found in nature. It didn't crumble like cheddar or melt smoothly like American cheese. It had its own unique properties that made it simultaneously terrible and strangely addictive. That 5-pound block would last for weeks, appearing in every meal. Your mom would slice it for sandwiches, melt it over vegetables, mix it into macaroni, and use it in every casserole imaginable. By the end, you were so sick of the taste that you'd beg for anything else. Yet there was also a strange pride in it. Your family was making it work, stretching that cheese into dozens of meals, wasting nothing. Today, people romanticize government cheese, but living with it was different. It was a constant reminder of where you stood economically, sitting right there in your refrigerator. In working-class homes of the 1970s, having a single bathroom for a family of 5, 6, or even 7 people wasn't unusual. It was standard. And that bathroom became a battleground every single morning, with elaborate schedules and unspoken rules that governed who got access and when. The morning routine was carefully choreographed chaos. Dad went first because he had to get to the factory by 6. Then Mom because she had to get everyone else ready. Then the oldest kid, then the next, all the way down the line. If you were the youngest, you learned to hold it or use the bathroom at school because by the time your turn came, there was no hot water left and you had exactly 3 minutes before the school bus arrived. Arguments over bathroom time were legendary. Siblings pounding on the door, parents yelling about water bills, someone always accusing someone else of taking too long, and if someone got sick, the entire household routine collapsed into chaos. There was no backup bathroom, no guest powder room, no ensuite attached to the master bedroom. There was one bathroom, and everyone had to make it work. Real orange juice and fresh milk were for special occasions or families with more money. In working-class homes, breakfast drinks came in powdered form that you'd mix with water, and the taste was a pale imitation of the real thing that everyone pretended was just as good. Tang was marketed as what astronauts drank, which made it sound exciting, but the reality was that it was cheap and lasted forever on the shelf. The experience of making it was its own ritual. Scooping the orange powder into a pitcher, watching it cloud the water, stirring until most of the clumps dissolved. It left a weird coating on your teeth and a strange aftertaste, but you drank it because that's what was in the refrigerator. Powdered milk was even worse. No matter how much you stirred, there were always little lumps floating in the liquid, and the taste was thin and slightly off. Your mom would try to hide it by mixing it half and half with real milk to stretch the real stuff further. but you could always tell. These powdered drinks represented economy over taste. Feeding a family on a factory worker's salary meant making compromises everywhere, even in something as basic as what you drank with breakfast. Hand-me-down clothes with visible patches. In working-class families of the 1970s, new clothes were rare events. Maybe for the first day of school, maybe for Christmas, but certainly not regularly. Instead, your wardrobe consisted of clothes that had been worn by your older siblings, your cousins, or the kids down the street. And when those clothes developed holes or tears, they didn't get thrown away. They got patched. The sensory experience of wearing hand-me-downs was complicated. Jeans that were already broken in, soft from dozens of washings, but also faded in weird patterns and worn thin at the knees. Shirts with collars that never quite lay flat anymore, and patches, iron-on patches over the knees of jeans, sewn patches on the elbows of shirts, decorative patches strategically placed to cover stains that wouldn't come out. Your mom would get creative with those patches, trying to make them look intentional rather than necessary. But you knew, and the other kids at school knew. The worst part wasn't wearing used clothes. It was wearing clothes that other kids recognized. You'd show up to school in a shirt that used to belong to your older brother, and kids would remember seeing him wear it 2 years ago. Working-class families in the 1970s relied heavily on TV dinners, not as an occasional convenience, but as a regular part of the meal rotation. When your mom worked a shift job or your dad worked overtime, TV dinners were what kept the family fed. The ritual started with the freezer packed with identical aluminum trays stacked efficiently because they were bought in bulk when on sale. The trays were covered in thin cardboard sleeves with pictures of food that looked nothing like what was actually inside. The Salisbury steak on the package was thick and juicy, while the real thing was a thin gray disc swimming in gelatinous gravy. The experience of eating a TV dinner was entirely distinct. The aluminum tray would be too hot to touch, but the food inside would somehow be simultaneously scalding and cold, with the edges burnt and the center still frozen. The compartmentalized sections meant your dessert would taste like your main course. But TV dinners represented a practical solution. They were affordable, required no preparation beyond turning on the oven, and meant your mom could work an evening shift without worrying about who would cook dinner. 5 down, and we're just scratching the surface of working-class 1970s life. What comes next cuts deeper. The furniture that announced your economic status the moment someone walked through your door. The healthcare decisions that weren't really decisions at all. The entertainment that cost nothing because it had to.
They're getting swore at, or for some of the children get swore at by the people in the flat.
Item 11 happened in kitchens across America every single week, and it's something wealthier families never had to consider. In working-class homes of the 1970s, furniture wasn't purchased as matching sets from furniture stores. It was accumulated piece by piece from discount outlets, garage sales, and most memorably, from the curb on trash day. The living room couch might have come from a going-out-of-business sale, the kitchen table from a relative who was upgrading, and the bedroom dresser from someone's curbside discard that your dad spotted on the way home from work. Nothing matched, everything had a history, and most pieces showed visible wear that couldn't be hidden. The couch might be covered with a bedspread to hide the stains and tears. The coffee table would have water rings and cigarette burns that your mom tried to cover with doilies. The dining chairs would be mismatched. 2 from one set, 3 from another, one that didn't match anything but was sturdy enough to use. Curbside finds were a particular source of both pride and shame. Your dad would come home excited about a dresser he'd found, and he'd spend the weekend sanding it down and restaining it. The result would be functional and sometimes even attractive, but you'd always know it came from someone else's trash. When friends came over, you'd see them taking in the mismatched furniture, the visible repairs. the overall sense that nothing in your house was quite new or quite nice enough. The late 1970s saw the rise of generic products, no-frills items in stark black and white packaging that simply said corn flakes or cola or paper towels, with no brand name, no logo, no marketing. For working-class families, these generic products became pantry staples, a visible marker of economic status that everyone understood. Shopping with your mom meant watching her reach past the name-brand cereals to grab the generic version that cost half as much. The generic cornflakes were somehow simultaneously too hard and too soft, never quite achieving the texture of the real thing. The generic cola tasted like someone had described Coke to someone who had never tasted it, and they'd tried to recreate it from that description. The black and white packaging was deliberately plain. No colorful boxes, no cartoon mascots, no excitement. When you brought generic products to school in your lunch, generic sandwich bags, generic cookies, generic chips, other kids noticed. The generic products represented a particular kind of 1970s working-class experience, the era when economic stratification became visible in your grocery cart, when you couldn't hide your family's financial situation because it was literally written in black and white on every product in your pantry. In working-class homes of the 1970s, there was one phone, a rotary dial phone, probably in an ugly color like avocado green or harvest gold, attached to the wall in the kitchen or hallway where everyone could hear every conversation. The concept of phone privacy didn't exist, and the phone itself was a source of constant family conflict. You'd have to wait until your dad was done calling about work, until your mom finished talking to her sister, until your older sibling got off the phone with their boyfriend or girlfriend. If you were expecting a call, you'd hover near the phone, glaring at anyone else who tried to use it. The phone had a long, coiled cord that stretched and tangled and eventually kinked in ways that could never be undone. If you wanted any semblance of privacy during a call, you'd stretch that cord as far as it would go, maybe into a closet or around a corner, but you could never get far enough away that family members couldn't hear at least your side of the conversation. That single phone represented the lack of privacy that defined working-class family life. Everything happened in shared spaces. Everyone knew everyone else's business. In working-class households of the 1970s, nothing got thrown away if it could possibly be repaired. Socks got darned, shirts got mended, broken appliances got fixed rather than replaced, and your mom had a sewing basket that was in constant use, filled with mismatched thread, salvaged buttons, and patches cut from clothes that were too far gone to save. The sensory experience of wearing mended clothes was distinctive. Socks with visible darning that created thick, uncomfortable lumps inside your shoes. Shirts with buttons that didn't quite match the originals. Jeans with patches on patches. Layers of repair that made the fabric stiff and bulky. Your mom would sit at the kitchen table in the evening with her sewing basket, going through the pile of items that needed repair. She'd darn socks by stretching them over a wooden darning egg, weaving thread back and forth across the hole, creating a patch that was functional but never comfortable. This constant mending wasn't a hobby or a choice. It was economic necessity. A new pair of jeans cost money your family didn't have to spare, so those jeans got patched and repatched until there was more patch than original denim. For working-class families in the 1970s, thrift stores and church rummage sales weren't trendy vintage shopping destinations. They were where you bought most of your clothes, household items, and sometimes even furniture. Shopping second-hand wasn't a choice or an environmental statement. It was economic necessity. The sensory experience of thrift store shopping was overwhelming. the smell of mothballs and old fabric and cleaning products, all mixed together in a distinctive odor that would cling to your clothes until they'd been washed multiple times. The racks packed so tightly you could barely flip through them, filled with clothes in every imaginable style, size, and condition. Your mom would methodically go through every rack, checking sizes, examining seams, looking for stains or damage. The finds could be good. Sometimes you'd discover something name brand, barely worn, that fit perfectly. But more often, you'd end up with clothes that were slightly wrong, pants that were the right waist size but the wrong length, shirts that fit in the shoulders but were too tight in the chest. The social stigma of thrift store shopping was real and painful. Other kids could tell when you were wearing thrift store clothes. They'd recognize items that were out of style, or they'd actually remember seeing someone else wear that exact shirt the previous year. 10 items in, and the picture of 1970s working-class life is becoming clearer. A world of constant repair, careful budgeting, and visible economic markers. But we're entering deeper territory now. The healthcare compromises, the education limitations, the entertainment that was free because it had to be. Item 16 sat in every working-class medicine cabinet, and using it meant accepting that professional healthcare was beyond your family's reach. In working-class kitchens of the 1970s, ground beef was expensive enough that it had to be stretched to feed an entire family. Your mom had a repertoire of techniques for making 1 pound of meat serve 6 or 7 people through the addition of cheap fillers. Breadcrumbs, oatmeal, rice, crackers, whatever was cheap and available. You'd watch your mom browning a pound of ground beef in a large skillet. The sizzle and pop of fat rendering out, the smell of cooking meat filling the small kitchen. But then, instead of using that meat as the base for a meal, she'd start adding things. The meat would be mixed with these fillers at ratios that seemed impossible. 1 part meat to 2 or even 3 parts filler. The texture of these stretched meat dishes was distinctive and not entirely pleasant. The grainy feel of oatmeal in meatloaf, the mushiness of too much breadcrumb in meatballs. Casseroles were the perfect vehicle for this kind of stretching. You could mix that extended ground beef with pasta or potatoes, add a can of cream of something soup, and call it dinner. The economics were brutal but simple. By stretching it with 50 cents worth of oatmeal or breadcrumbs, that same amount of meat could feed 6 or 7 people instead of 3. Professional. Haircuts were an expense that working-class families couldn't justify when your mom could cut hair for free, even though the results were often disastrous. The home haircut was a rite of passage in working-class childhood, and it left you marked with visible evidence of your family's economic status every time you went to school. You'd sit on a kitchen chair with a towel draped around your shoulders, your mom standing behind you with scissors that were probably meant for cutting paper or fabric rather than hair. She'd wet your hair with a spray bottle, and you'd feel the cold water running down your neck. She'd start cutting, and you'd hear the snip-snip of the scissors, feel the pull on your hair when the scissors weren't quite sharp enough. Your mom would try her best, but she wasn't a trained hairstylist. The results were predictably bad. Bangs that were crooked, sides that were uneven, a general shape that looked vaguely like a haircut but was clearly not professional. The worst part was facing the other kids at school the next day. They'd notice immediately. Kids always noticed haircuts, and they especially noticed bad haircuts. The home haircut was another visible marker of being working class, another way your economic status was written on your body for everyone to see. In working-class households of the 1970s, utility bills were a constant source of stress, and shut-off notices were a regular occurrence. The envelope would arrive, usually pink or yellow, some color designed to grab attention, and your parents' faces would change when they saw it, a mixture of anger, shame, and worry that you learned to recognize even as a child. The notices would be posted on the refrigerator. Final notice: your electricity will be disconnected on date unless payment is received. Your parents would discuss them in tense, quiet voices after you were supposed to be in bed, trying to figure out which bill could be paid late to cover this one. You'd become hyper-aware of electricity usage, turning off lights religiously, being yelled at if you left something running. In winter, the thermostat would be set low, 60 degrees or even lower, and you'd wear layers of clothing indoors, sleep under piles of blankets. Sometimes the utilities would actually get shut off, and you'd come home from school to a dark house, no lights working, no TV, no refrigerator humming. This constant precariousness around basic utilities taught you that things middle-class people took for granted, heat, electricity, running water, were privileges that could be taken away if you didn't have enough money. In the 1970s, cable television was becoming available in many areas, offering dozens of channels, better reception, and premium content. But for working-class families, cable was an impossible luxury. So you watched network television received through an antenna with all the limitations and frustrations that entailed. You had 3, maybe 4 channels if you were lucky, and your antenna was positioned just right. The picture quality depended on weather, atmospheric conditions, and mysterious factors that no one quite understood. You'd be watching a show when suddenly the picture would dissolve into static, and someone would have to go adjust the antenna while someone else stayed by the TV and yelled instructions, "Better, worse, go back." The picture was never perfect. There was always some snow, some ghosting, some interference. You couldn't pause live TV, couldn't record shows to watch later, and couldn't watch anything that wasn't being broadcast at that exact moment. Working-class kids would hear their friends at school talking about movies they'd watched on HBO or special programs on cable channels, and you'd have no frame of reference. This limitation in entertainment options was another marker of working-class life. You were consuming the free, lowest-tier version of media, while wealthier families had access to a whole world of content that you couldn't see. The school lunch program was designed to ensure that all children had access to adequate nutrition, but in the 1970s, the system of identifying which children received free or reduced-price lunch was often humiliating and stigmatizing. The lunch tickets or meal cards that working-class children used were visibly different from those used by children who paid full price. The experience varied by school, but the common thread was visibility. Some schools used different colored tickets. Full-price students had one color, free lunch students had another. Some schools had lists that lunch workers would consult, calling out names of free lunch students or requiring them to show special identification. Whatever the system, it was designed in a way that made it obvious to everyone around you that you were receiving free lunch. You'd wait in line with your classmates, watching the kids ahead of you hand over their lunch money or their regular tickets, and then you'd reach the front and have to present your free lunch ticket or give your name to be checked off a list. The lunch worker would process your meal differently, and everyone behind you in line would see it happening. Some kids would make comments, sometimes outright cruel, sometimes just thoughtless observations about free lunch kids. The system taught you early that poverty was something to be ashamed of, that needing help was a public humiliation. In working-class families of the 1970s, going to the doctor was reserved for emergencies. Broken bones, severe injuries, conditions that absolutely couldn't be ignored. Everything else got treated at home with over-the-counter medications, home remedies, and a philosophy of wait and see if it gets better on its own. You'd wake up with a sore throat, a fever, or a persistent cough, and your mom would feel your forehead with her hand, the only diagnostic tool available. If you weren't burning up, you were going to school. If you had a fever, you'd stay home, but there would be no doctor visit unless it persisted for days or got significantly worse. Instead, you'd get children's aspirin or Tylenol, doses carefully measured to stretch the bottle as far as possible. The medicine itself was always generic: store-brand pain relievers, cough syrup that came in large bottles because it was cheaper per ounce. Certain conditions simply went untreated because the treatment required a prescription: chronic ear infections, dental problems, vision issues, persistent coughs that might have been asthma. You'd learn to live with discomfort, to accept that some things hurt, and that was just how it was. The emergency room was a place of last resort, used only when something was genuinely life-threatening, because an ER visit meant bills that would take months or years to pay off. Working-class families in the 1970s drove old cars, not vintage or classic cars, but simply old, worn-out vehicles that had been cheap to buy because they were already on their last legs. These cars were constantly breaking down, constantly needing repairs that your dad would try to do himself in the driveway, and the unreliability created a constant undercurrent of stress. The feel of the steering wheel shaking at certain speeds, the way the car would hesitate when you tried to accelerate. The car would be rusted, not surface rust, but structural rust that ate through the body panels, creating holes you could see through. The interior would be worn and torn, seats with springs poking through, carpeting that was threadbare or missing entirely. Your dad would spend weekend after weekend under the hood trying to fix whatever had broken most recently. The breakdowns themselves created family crises. Your mom would be stranded at work when the car wouldn't start. Your dad would be late to his shift because the car died on the highway. The economic trap was brutal. The car was unreliable, but buying a better car required money your family didn't have. Dishwashers were becoming common in middle-class homes by the 1970s, but working-class families either didn't have one or had one that had broken and couldn't be repaired. This meant that every single dish, pot, pan, and utensil used by the family had to be washed by hand, creating hours of daily labor. The nightly ritual of washing dishes was a defining feature of working-class family life. After dinner, the kitchen sink would be filled with hot water and dish soap, and the pile of dirty dishes would be tackled in assembly line fashion. In larger families, this could mean washing dishes for an hour or more every single night. The sensory experience was thoroughly unpleasant. Hands in hot, soapy water until they were pruned and raw, the smell of dish soap mixing with the smell of food residue, the greasy feeling of washing pot that had been used to cook meat. Your hands would dry out from the constant exposure, developing cracks and rough patches. The broken dishwasher, if you had one, would sit there as a constant reminder of what you didn't have: a large appliance taking up space in the kitchen, completely non-functional but too expensive to repair or replace. In the 1970s, credit cards were less common and less accessible for working-class families, so major purchases, a winter coat, school clothes, Christmas presents, were often made through layaway plans. This system required you to pay for items gradually over weeks or months before you could actually take them home. You'd go to the store with your mom, select the items you needed, and take them to the layaway counter. The clerk would write up a contract specifying the total price and the payment schedule. The items would be tagged with your name and stored in the back of the store, inaccessible to you until the final payment was made. The experience created a strange state of suspended ownership. The item was yours. It had your name on it. You were paying for it, but it also wasn't yours because you couldn't use it. Your winter coat would go on layaway in September, and you'd make payments through October and November, finally getting it in December when winter was already in full swing. The system had built-in anxiety. If you missed a payment or couldn't complete the payment plan, the store would put the items back on the shelves and keep a portion of what you'd already paid. Layaway represented a different relationship with consumption. Working-class families had to plan ahead, pay gradually, and wait. For working-class families in the 1970s, the public library was a primary source of entertainment because it was free. Books, magazines, and eventually records and movies could be borrowed at no cost, making the library a crucial resource for families who couldn't afford to buy entertainment. You'd walk into the building with its distinctive smell of old books and floor wax and quiet, and you'd head to the children's section looking for books to check out. The limit was usually generous, 10 or 12 books at a time, and you'd carefully select titles that would last you the 2 weeks until they were due back. The books themselves would be well-worn, covers creased and faded, pages dog-eared, sometimes with marginalia or stains from previous readers. You'd check the due date slip in the back to see how many other people had read this book, and you'd feel a connection to all those other readers, all those other families who had also borrowed this book because they couldn't afford to buy it. The library became a refuge, a place where you could spend hours without spending money, where the fact that you were poor didn't matter because everyone had equal access to the collection. But there was also an awareness that this was your primary source of entertainment because you couldn't afford alternatives. The library card represented both opportunity and limitation. It gave you access to knowledge and stories, but it also marked the boundary of what your family could afford. In working-class homes during the 1970s, heating the entire house was often unaffordable, especially during the coldest months. The solution was to heat one room, usually the living room or kitchen, and close off the rest of the house, creating a single warm space where the family would congregate while the rest of the house remained cold. During winter, the family would essentially live in one room. You'd do homework at the kitchen table instead of in your bedroom. You'd watch TV bundled in blankets. The bedrooms would be closed off during the day, and at night you'd make a run for it, leaving the warm room and sprinting to your freezing bedroom, diving under multiple layers of blankets and quilts. The sensory experience was stark, the sharp contrast between the heated room and the rest of the house, stepping from warmth into cold that made your breath visible. Your bedroom would be so cold that getting up in the morning required genuine courage. The bathroom would be frigid, making showers an ordeal. The single heated room would be crowded and stuffy, with no privacy, no personal space, everyone occupying the same room because it was the only comfortable place in the house. In the 1970s, school extracurricular activities, sports teams, band, drama club, field trips, all came with costs that working-class families often couldn't afford. The fees for uniforms, equipment, instruments, travel, and participation created barriers that excluded working-class children from experiences that were formative for their wealthier peers. You'd hear about tryouts for the basketball team or auditions for the school play, and you'd be interested until you took home the information packet and showed it to your parents. They'd look at the list of required fees and equipment, do the mental math, and their faces would fall. They'd explain that the family couldn't afford it, that the money just wasn't there. The costs were cumulative and often hidden. The initial participation fee might seem manageable, but then there were uniforms, equipment, travel costs for away games, fundraising requirements. A sport that started at $50 would end up costing $200 or $300 by the end of the season. The social cost of non-participation was significant. You'd watch your classmates bond over shared experiences, forming friendships and memories that you weren't part of. The exclusion from extracurricular activities limited your educational opportunities in ways that extended far beyond high school. College applications asked about activities and leadership roles, and you had nothing to list. Working-class families in the 1970s couldn't afford to waste food, which meant that expiration dates were treated as suggestions rather than absolute limits. Food that was past its prime, nearly expired, or slightly off would be carefully evaluated, and if it seemed safe enough, it would be served. Your mom would smell the milk before using it, checking for sourness. She'd cut mold off cheese and use the rest. She'd trim brown spots off produce and cook the remaining portions. Bread that was stale would be turned into French toast or bread pudding. Meat that was approaching or past its sell-by date would be cooked thoroughly and heavily seasoned to mask any off flavors. The sensory experience was sometimes unpleasant. Milk that was just starting to turn, not quite sour, but not quite fresh. Produce that was soft and bruised, meat that had been frozen and refrozen, with ice crystals and freezer burn. Your mom would shop the discount bins at the grocery store, buying meat and produce that was marked down because it was approaching its expiration date. The economic logic was brutal but undeniable. Throwing away food meant throwing away money, and when money was this tight, waste was unacceptable. Many working-class families in the 1970s simply couldn't afford to heat their homes to comfortable temperatures, which meant that wearing coats, hats, and layers indoors during winter was normal and necessary. You'd wake up in a cold house and get dressed while still under the covers, pulling on multiple layers before facing the frigid air. You'd eat breakfast wearing a coat at the kitchen table. You'd do homework with gloves on because your fingers were too cold to write otherwise. You'd watch TV bundled in blankets, and you'd go to bed wearing more clothing than you wore outside during mild weather. The sensory details were oppressive. Seeing your breath indoors, a constant reminder that the house was too cold. The way your nose and ears would ache from the cold even though you were inside your own home. Ice forming on the inside of windows, creating beautiful but troubling frost patterns. The contrast with school or other heated spaces was jarring. You'd arrive at school and be overwhelmed by how warm it was, and you'd dread going home to the cold house. Every August, as the new school year approached, working-class families would face the challenge of buying school supplies on a minimal budget. While wealthier families shopped at office supply stores buying name-brand supplies, working-class families went to dollar stores buying the cheapest possible versions of everything on the school supply list. You'd walk through the aisles with your mom, looking at the thin notebooks with covers that would tear within weeks, the pens that would skip and leak, the crayons that were waxy and pale, the scissors that wouldn't cut properly. Everything was the cheapest possible version, and you knew from experience that none of it would last the school year. The quality difference was immediately apparent when you started using these supplies. The notebook paper was so thin that ink would bleed through. The pencils would break constantly. The erasers would smear rather than erase. The folders would split at the seams within weeks. Other kids would notice and comment on the quality of your things. The supplies would fail at the worst possible times. Your pen would run out of ink during a test. Your notebook would fall apart, losing pages. This annual ritual taught you that even education came with costs that were distributed unequally. In working-class families of the 1970s, children's education was important, but it wasn't always the top priority when economic crises hit. Kids would miss school to help with family emergencies, staying home to watch younger siblings when childcare fell through, accompanying a parent to deal with a car breakdown or utility shut-off, or staying home alone when a parent had to work an extra shift. You'd know you should be in school, that you were falling behind, that the absence would be noticed and recorded, but you also understood that your family needed you, that there was no other option, that sometimes survival took precedence over education. You'd stay home and do whatever was needed, watching your younger siblings, waiting for the repairman, dealing with some crisis. The educational impact was cumulative and significant. Every absence meant missed lessons, missed assignments, gaps in your understanding that would make future lessons harder to follow. Teachers would notice your absences, and some would be understanding while others would be judgmental. The pattern of absences would show up on your permanent record, affecting your grades, your standing with teachers, and eventually your opportunities for college. In working-class homes of the 1970s, newspapers served dozens of purposes beyond reading. It was insulation, packing material, cleaning supplies, and general-purpose problem solver. The accumulation of old newspapers in working-class homes wasn't hoarding, it was resource management. You'd stuff newspaper into the cracks around windows and doors to block drafts, creating makeshift weather stripping. You'd crumple newspaper and pack it into shoes that were too big, making them fit better. You'd use newspaper as packing material when moving, as padding for packages, as drop cloths when painting. Your mom would use newspaper for cleaning. Wadded up and dampened, it was surprisingly effective for washing windows. She'd line shelves with newspaper, use it to wrap food scraps, to absorb grease from fried foods. The house would have stacks of old newspapers in various locations, waiting to be used for some future project. This reliance on newspaper and other free materials taught you to see value in things that others threw away, to be creative about solving problems with limited resources. Eating at restaurants was a rare luxury for working-class families in the 1970s, reserved for special occasions. And when it did happen, the meal was carefully managed to minimize cost. This often meant family members sharing meals, ordering water instead of drinks, skipping appetizers and desserts. You'd look at the menu and immediately check the prices, looking for the cheapest options. Your parents would suggest that you and your siblings share a meal, or that the whole family order a few items and split them. You'd order water because drinks were expensive. You'd skip the appetizers even if you were hungry. The social awkwardness was significant. You'd see other families ordering freely, getting drinks and appetizers and desserts, not worrying about the cost. The server would come to take your order, and your parents would explain that 2 children were sharing one meal. Sometimes servers would be accommodating. Sometimes they'd be judgmental. The drive home would often be tense. Your parents would be worried about whether they'd spent too much, whether the meal had been worth the cost. Dental care in the 1970s was expensive and not covered by most health insurance plans available to working-class families, which meant that dental care was essentially non-existent except for emergencies. Regular checkups, cleanings, and preventive care were luxuries that working-class families couldn't afford. You'd get a toothache and your parents would give you aspirin and tell you to tough it out. If the pain persisted for days or weeks, if it got bad enough that you couldn't eat or sleep, then, and only then, would they take you to a dentist. The treatment would be whatever was absolutely necessary to stop the immediate pain, usually an extraction rather than a filling or root canal, because extractions were cheaper. The sensory experience of dental problems without care was miserable. The constant ache of cavities, the sharp pain when you ate something hot or cold or sweet. You'd see your teeth deteriorating in the mirror, visible cavities, discoloration, chips and cracks, and know that nothing was being done about it. You'd learn to smile with your mouth closed to hide your bad teeth. By the time you reached adulthood, you'd likely have multiple missing teeth, numerous cavities, gum disease, and other dental problems that had been accumulating since childhood. The final and perhaps most defining experience of growing up working class in the 1970s was the constant awareness of things that existed in the world but were beyond your reach. You'd see them advertised on TV, displayed in stores, owned by wealthier classmates, but you knew with certainty that they weren't for you. This wasn't abstract knowledge. It was a concrete understanding that settled into your bones before you were old enough to name it. A daily education in the geography of inequality that mapped itself onto your childhood in ways both obvious and subtle. You'd watch TV commercials for toys and games and think about how fun they looked, but you'd never ask for them because you knew the answer would be no. The learning curve on this was steep and painful. Maybe you asked once or twice when you were very young and you saw your mother's face change, not angry, but something worse. A kind of sadness mixed with frustration, a look that said she wished she could give you these things but couldn't, and your asking made her feel like she was failing you. So you stopped asking. You learned to watch those commercials with a different kind of attention. Not the anticipatory excitement of, maybe I'll get that, but more like watching a documentary about a foreign country you'd never visit. Interesting, but not for you. You'd walk through stores with your mom and see things you wanted. A new bike, a particular toy, nice clothes. But you'd learned not to ask, not to point them out, not to express the wanting because it would just make everyone feel bad. Shopping trips with your mother were exercises in restraint and reality. You'd go to the store for specific necessities, school supplies in August, winter coats when the old ones no longer fit, shoes when the current pair had holes. These weren't browsing expeditions or recreational shopping trips. They were missions with clear objectives and strict budgets, and deviating from the plan wasn't an option. You'd walk past the toy aisle and maybe glance down it, seeing the brightly colored boxes, the action figures, the board games, the bicycles. Your mom would keep walking, and you'd keep pace with her, not asking to stop, not asking to look closer, not asking for anything. Sometimes she'd notice you looking and say something like, maybe for your birthday, or we'll see about Christmas. But you both knew these were polite fictions, ways of acknowledging your desire without having to confront the reality that birthdays and Christmas would bring modest gifts, practical things, not the expensive toys you'd seen in the store. The other kids at school would talk about their new toys, their new bikes, their new video game systems, and you'd listen and nod and try to contribute to the conversation without revealing that you had no idea what they were talking about because you'd never owned any of these things. You became skilled at conversational camouflage, at asking questions that made you seem engaged rather than ignorant, at deflecting attention away from your own lack of possessions. Oh, yeah, that sounds cool. How does that work? You'd learn the features and functions of toys you'd never touch, becoming an expert on products you'd never own, just so you could participate in playground conversations without marking yourself as the poor kid who didn't have anything. The dreams themselves were often modest by middle-class standards. You didn't dream of exotic vacations or luxury items. You dreamed of having your own bedroom, of getting new clothes instead of hand-me-downs, of going to a restaurant without your parents stressing about money, of having school supplies that worked properly, of not being cold in your own house. These basic comforts that others took for granted were the substance of your dreams, and even these modest aspirations felt impossibly distant, Having your own bedroom was a fantasy that occupied significant mental real estate. You shared a room with siblings, maybe one, maybe two or three. There was no privacy, no personal space, no place that was just yours. Your clothes were in a shared dresser, your bed was in a room with other beds, and every moment of your home life was witnessed by others. You'd see TV shows where kids had their own rooms, decorated however they wanted, with doors they could close, and it seemed like science fiction. A room of your own, a door you could shut, a space where you could think your own thoughts without someone else always being there. It was such a simple thing, such a basic thing, and it was completely out of reach. New clothes were another impossible dream. Your wardrobe consisted entirely of hand-me-downs from older siblings or cousins, or occasionally from thrift stores. Nothing fit quite right. Nothing was in current style. Nothing was yours in the sense that you'd chosen it, or that it had been bought specifically for you. You'd see other kids at school in new clothes, clothes that fit properly, clothes that were trendy, clothes that weren't worn thin or faded or patched. You'd imagine what it would feel like to put on a shirt that no one else had ever worn, pants that didn't have someone else's knee-wear patterns already broken in, shoes that weren't shaped to someone else's feet just once, to have something new, something that was yours from the beginning. It seemed like an extravagance beyond imagining. Going to a restaurant without your parents stressing about money was another modest dream that felt unattainable. The rare times your family ate out, maybe once or twice a year for a special occasion, were marked by visible tension. Your parents would study the menu with furrowed brows, doing mental math, calculating costs, looking for the cheapest options. They'd suggest you and your siblings share meals. They'd order water instead of sodas. They'd skip appetizers and desserts. You'd see other families at restaurants, families who seemed relaxed and happy, who ordered whatever they wanted without checking prices, who got appetizers and desserts and didn't seem worried about the bill. You'd wonder what that felt like. To sit in a restaurant and just enjoy the experience, to order what sounded good rather than what was cheapest, to not have your parents' anxiety about money hanging over the entire meal. It seemed like a different way of existing in the world, a freedom you couldn't quite imagine experiencing yourself. Having school supplies that worked properly was another basic desire that felt out of reach. You'd show up to school with cheap pens that skipped, pencils that broke constantly, notebooks that fell apart, folders that tore. Your supplies were always the generic dollar store versions that barely functioned, and you'd watch other kids use name-brand supplies that worked smoothly, that lasted the whole school year, that didn't make every assignment harder than it needed to be. You'd imagine what it would be like to have a pen that wrote consistently, a notebook that didn't lose pages, scissors that actually cut paper. These tiny improvements would make school so much easier, but they cost money your family didn't have, so you made do with supplies that failed constantly and made everything more difficult. Not being cold in your own house was perhaps the most basic comfort you dreamed of, and even that was beyond reach. Winter meant being cold constantly, cold in your bedroom, cold in the bathroom, cold everywhere except the one room your family heated. You'd go to friends' houses and be amazed that their whole house was warm, that they could walk around in t-shirts in the middle of winter, that they didn't have to wear coats indoors or sleep under piles of blankets. You'd dream about living in a house that was just warm, all the time, in every room. It seemed like the height of luxury, this basic physical comfort that was standard in middle-class homes, but unattainable in yours. But there was also a kind of freedom in knowing that certain things were impossible. You didn't waste energy hoping for things that were clearly beyond reach. You learned to find satisfaction in what you had, to create your own entertainment, to appreciate small pleasures. This adaptation was both a survival mechanism and a genuine shift in perspective. When you knew that store-bought toys were out of the question, you became creative with what you had. Cardboard boxes became forts, spaceships, race cars, sticks became swords, wands, fishing poles. Your imagination had to work harder because your resources were limited, and in some ways, this made play richer and more creative than it might have been with unlimited access to manufactured toys. You learned to find joy in free things, playing outside, riding bikes, even if they were old and rusty, exploring the neighborhood, creating elaborate games with friends that required nothing but imagination and time. You learned to appreciate small treats, a candy bar, a soda, a trip to the park, in ways that kids with more might not have. When pleasures were rare, they became more significant. A special meal, a small gift, an unexpected outing. These things carried weight and meaning because they were exceptional rather than routine. Teachers and guidance counselors often reinforced these limitations, steering working-class kids toward vocational training rather than college prep, suggesting realistic career goals that matched your economic background rather than your actual abilities or interests. The message was clear: know your place, don't reach too high, be satisfied with what's available to people like you. Some kids internalized this completely, accepting these limitations as natural and inevitable. Others rebelled against it, but rebellion required energy and determination that not everyone had, especially when you were already exhausted from dealing with the daily stresses of poverty. The psychological impact of growing up with constrained dreams extended far beyond childhood. Many working-class kids carried these limitations into adulthood, continuing to dream small, continuing to feel like certain opportunities weren't for them, continuing to accept less than they deserved because they'd been trained from childhood to expect less. Breaking free from these mental constraints was often harder than overcoming the actual economic barriers, because the economic barriers were external and could potentially be changed, while the psychological barriers were internal and felt like fundamental truths about yourself and your place in the world. Some working-class kids developed what psychologists call imposter syndrome, the feeling that they didn't belong in spaces or positions typically occupied by people from wealthier backgrounds. Even when they achieved success, even when they earned the right to be in those spaces, they felt like frauds, like they'd somehow snuck in where they didn't belong, like at any moment someone would realize they were just a poor kid pretending to be something they weren't. This feeling could persist for decades, a lasting legacy of childhood lessons about knowing your place. Others developed a kind of hypervigilance about money that never went away. Even after achieving financial stability as adults, they couldn't shake the anxiety about resources, the need to save compulsively, the fear that it could all disappear at any moment. They'd see their bank account balance growing and still feel poor, still feel like they couldn't afford things, still feel that childhood scarcity, even in the midst of adult abundance. The poverty of childhood had marked them so deeply that they couldn't fully believe in or enjoy financial security even when they achieved it. The working-class 1970s was a time of visible economic stratification where poverty was written on your body, in your home, in every aspect of your daily life. It wasn't hidden or subtle, it was obvious and public. Your clothes announced your economic status, your house announced it, your lunch at school announced it, your lack of participation in extracurricular activities announced it, your hand-me-downs, your patched jeans, your too-small coat, your generic school supplies, all of these things marked you as poor in ways that everyone could see and that you couldn't hide. This visibility created a particular kind of shame that was hard to articulate, but deeply felt. It wasn't just that you were poor, it was that everyone knew you were poor, that your poverty was on display every day, that you couldn't escape the public nature of your family's financial struggles. Middle-class people could sometimes experience financial difficulties privately, behind closed doors, maintaining appearances in public, but working-class poverty was too pervasive, too all-encompassing to hide. It showed in every aspect of your life, and everyone could see it. This public nature of poverty created social dynamics that were painful and complex. Some kids were cruel, making fun of poor kids' clothes or circumstances. Others were awkwardly sympathetic, which sometimes felt worse than cruelty because it highlighted the gap between you and them, the fact that they saw you as someone to pity. Still others simply didn't understand, asking innocent questions that revealed how different their lives were from yours, questions that made you aware of all the things you didn't have that they took for granted.